I never imagined things would go this way. When I first met Jake, he just seemed like a regular single dad at our daughter's dance class. The place was always chaotic, kids running around, pop music blaring, and parents trying to get in a bit of adult conversation. I'd been taking my 15-year-old daughter Lila there for years. She loved it, and it was her thing. One evening, I decided to stay for the class. Normally, I'd just drop her off and come back later, but I was exhausted, and I had this work problem rattling around in my head that I was trying to figure out. I found a spot on the bleachers, settled in, and that's when I noticed Jake sitting a few rows down. He was hard to miss. Tall, relaxed, with this kind smile that made him look approachable. He was watching his daughter Jenna, who was a year older than Lila. She had this easygoing vibe about her, much like her dad. Jake and I started talking, and it turned out we had a lot in common. I was 5 years divorced from someone who was, well, let's just say not around. Jake, on the other hand, was a widower. His wife had passed away 3 years before, and he'd been raising Jenna on his own. It felt easy talking to him. We didn't have to explain the struggles of raising a teenager alone. We both got it. That mix of pride and worry that goes hand in hand with being the only parent they depend on. Those casual chats after dance class became a thing. We'd grab a coffee, sometimes even go to dinner with the girls. I learned that Jake worked in IT and had a flexible schedule that let him be there for Jenna, while I was always trying to balance my marketing job with being a mom to Lila. I'd be up late juggling deadlines and takeout dinners, hoping my daughter wasn't feeling neglected. One chilly evening, as we were sipping hot chocolate, Jake floated an idea. What if we moved in together? He made it sound casual, but I could see he'd thought about it a lot. The girls seem to get along, he said, and it could be easier on us, financially and, emotionally. It was a huge step, and at first I wasn't sure. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Both of our leases were up soon, and it really did feel like the girls liked each other. They weren't best friends, but there wasn't any friction. Once we agreed to try it, finding the right house became our mission. We needed something close to the girls' schools and our work. We settled on a place that was spacious, though it needed some TLC. Moving in was hectic. Boxes everywhere, furniture that didn't fit, and a to-do list that seemed to grow by the minute. But somehow, it felt like a fresh start. The girls picked their rooms, Jenna decorating hers with band posters and trophies from her dance competitions, and Lila filling hers with books and a little art desk. Seeing them make these spaces their own gave me a sense of hope. Maybe this was actually going to work. Our first dinner together in the new house was a complete mess. Pizza on paper plates in the living room because the kitchen was still in shambles. But we laughed, sharing stories about past cooking disasters, and for a moment it felt like real family. Maybe a bit unconventional, but a family nonetheless. But as the days turned into weeks, it was clear that blending our lives wasn't going to be easy. The girls were polite to each other but guarded, like they were waiting to see who would crack first. Little things, like who picked the movie or whose turn it was to load the dishwasher, started becoming points of friction. Jake and I tried to step in gently, but we both knew this was only the beginning of blending two different households with two different ways of doing things. Mornings were peaceful enough, with Jake in the kitchen making his famous pancakes and bacon, but the nights? Those were a whole different story. Jake had this hands-on approach to parenting, always trying to make chores fun, turning them into games that worked wonders for Jenna. But my approach was more structured, routine-based. With my work schedule, it felt necessary. Sometimes our styles clashed. Homework time became a constant struggle. Jenna would procrastinate until the last minute, while Lila would dive into her assignments right after school. I found myself mediating, trying to let Jake do his thing while still keeping some structure. I wanted the girls to have fun, but I also knew school and responsibilities couldn't just fall by the wayside. Dinner was our big attempt at bonding, and some nights it worked. We'd talk about the highs and lows of our day, with stories and laughter filling the room. But other nights it was like sitting at the table with strangers. I tried to keep things light, but the smallest disagreement over something like who should clear the dishes could set off a whole wave of tension. There was one evening I remember well. I had introduced a new rule: no phones at the dinner table. I just wanted us to have some real face-to-face time. But it didn't go over well. Jenna called it ridiculous. And even Lila, my rule follower, seemed to side-eye me. Jake backed me up, but I could tell he was uncomfortable, not wanting to upset his daughter. Weekends, we tried to spend as a family. We planned outings to parks, movie nights, and even a few cookouts with neighbours. Sometimes the girls got along, laughing and chatting like sisters, but other times they kept their distance, buried in their phones or bringing friends along so they wouldn't have to interact too much. Jake and I decided to give them space, hoping that with time, they'd naturally bond. But things only got trickier. One weekend, we went to a local art museum. Lila, always the artist, wanted to linger in each room, soaking in the exhibits. Jenna, on the other hand, was ready to leave almost as soon as we got there, more interested in the gift shop than the art itself. A petty argument broke out over where to eat lunch afterward, each girl refusing to budge. It felt like the museum day had turned into an all-out standoff, each of them digging in their heels just to prove a point. Still, there were these rare moments where it seemed like things might just work. I remember one rainy Sunday when the power went out. With no TV or internet, we ended up playing board games by candlelight. It was one of the few times I saw the girls laughing together, truly enjoying each other's company as they got competitive over the game. Jake and I exchanged hopeful smiles, silently crossing our fingers that this might be a breakthrough. Then came the holidays. If things had been tense before, the holidays only made it worse. Both girls had their own traditions and expectations, and Jake and I were determined to honour them all. We blended decorations, a mix of Lila's love for classic red and green, and Jenna's preference for modern silver and blue. We even cooked both families' favourite dishes for Christmas dinner, and the girls got involved in the cooking. For a moment, things felt almost harmonious. But the holidays brought their own pressures. Buying gifts became a sore spot, with each girl feeling like the other was being favoured. I did my best to keep things even, but Lila noticed every small detail, like if Jenna's gift looked slightly bigger or if I spent a little more on her. And it all came to a head on Christmas Eve when they opened a shared gift, a video game console Jake had bought. The plan was for it to stay in the living room, but Lila was upset, thinking it was unfair that it would be in Jenna's territory rather than her room. When the new year came, I took a moment to look back at our first few months together. It had been anything but easy, and there were plenty of days I questioned whether we'd made the right decision to blend our families like this. But then, I'd remember those fleeting moments, the board games, the rare shared laughs, and I'd hold on to them, hoping that they were signs that things might eventually work out. Jake was always there, ready with his optimistic smile, and I could feel myself settling into a kind of determination. I was going to keep trying, keep hoping that we'd find our rhythm. Family isn't just about the good times, I reminded myself. It's about pushing through the hard ones together too. Little did I know the hardest days were still ahead of us. By the time spring rolled around, I thought things would start smoothing out, that maybe we'd settle into some kind of routine. But honestly, living together was starting to feel like we were navigating one landmine after another. Every time we'd think things were calm, another problem would pop up. I kept telling myself it was normal, that we were all adjusting, but it was exhausting. Lelia and Jenna had their moments of getting along, sure, but more often it was like an invisible wall had come up between them. Lila was quieter, focused on school and her art. Jenna was more social, bringing friends over often, sometimes without even checking with me or Jake. That's when things started to feel off. Lila would come home from school to find Jenna and her friends in the living room, loud and sprawled out, taking over. And it wasn't just once or twice. It started to happen regularly. One night, Lila came to me and said, "Mum, it's like I don't have any space here. Jenna and her friends just do whatever they want, and if I say anything, they make me feel like I'm the weird one." I could see the frustration in her eyes, a look I'd started noticing more and more. I promised her I'd talk to Jake and try to figure out a way to set some boundaries. So I brought it up with Jake that night after the girls had gone to bed. He was quiet, listening, and then he sighed. "I get it. Jenna's used to having friends over. She's not trying to push Lila out. But maybe I can talk to her about giving Lila a heads up or keeping the noise down. He seemed understanding enough, but I could tell he was torn. He didn't want to make Jenna feel unwelcome in her own home, and I understood that. I didn't want that either. We agreed on some basic rules for both girls. Ask before bringing friends over, try to keep common spaces open for everyone, and respect each other's belongings. Simple enough, right? I hoped it would help ease the tension, but the rules only seemed to irritate Jenna. The next day, I overheard her talking to her friends about how weird our rules were. I didn't say anything, I just let it go, thinking she was venting. But the next few weeks, she kept pushing, bringing her friends over without asking, leaving things in a mess, and treating the house like her personal hangout. And every time I brought it up, Jake would say, "She's a teenager. This is just what they do." I could feel the cracks widening between us, and it was getting harder to ignore. Things came to a head one Saturday when Jake and I planned a family day at the zoo. It was supposed to be a chance to get everyone out, do something fun, and maybe even get the girls to bond a little. But when Jenna found out she couldn't bring Kayla along, she refused to come. Jake tried to convince her, telling her it would be good for the family, but she was set on staying home. When Jake finally gave in, I couldn't hide my frustration. "We're trying to make this family work, Jake. She can't just skip out every time something doesn't go her way, Dot." He looked at me, exasperated. "I know, but I can't force her. She'll resent it. Besides, we can still have a nice day with Lila." I wanted to believe that, but it felt like every plan we made as a family was just falling apart. Lila and I went with Jake, but Jenna's absence hung over us. We went through the motions, looking at animals, snapping a few photos, but I could tell Lila felt it too. She kept glancing over at Jake as if wondering when he was going to set a real boundary with Jenna. After the zoo, things got even more strained. Jake's approach to parenting was different than mine, and it was becoming clearer that he wasn't going to budge. He believed in letting Jenna make her own choices, and while I respected that, it felt like he was letting her run the house. One evening, after a particularly rough day of trying to balance work and parenting, I made dinner and asked everyone to come to the table. Jenna showed up with her phone in hand, texting away, barely looking up. Lila shot me a glance and I could tell she was uncomfortable. I asked Jenna to put the phone away, reminding her of our no phones at dinner rule. Jenna rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, but put the phone down. Jake was watching, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled with my approach. After dinner, he pulled me aside and said, "Look, I know you're trying, but Jenna's not used to so many rules. She's used to a bit more freedom." I was getting frustrated. "Jake, I'm just asking for a little respect, that's all. Lila follows the rules, so why can't Jenna? It's like everything I ask gets undermined, Dot." He was silent for a moment, then said, "I know. I just don't want to push her too hard. She's been through a lot, Dot. We were at an impasse and it was wearing me down. I wanted to support him, to give Jenna the understanding she needed, but at what cost? My own daughter was starting to feel like a stranger in her own home. Then came the K-pop concert incident, a last-ditch effort to bring the girls closer. Lila had been a fan for ages, and she found out that Jenna liked one of the bands too. She suggested they go together, and I was over the moon, hoping it might be the bonding experience we'd been waiting for. They spent weeks planning. Lila was picking out her outfit, and I could hear her and Jenna chatting about their favourite songs. For once, they seemed like two regular sisters, excited about the same thing. Jake and I were thrilled, thinking maybe this was the moment things would turn around. The day of the concert, we let Jenna drive. She'd just gotten her license, and Jake thought it was a good step toward independence. "It's only a 30-minute drive on the highway. They'll be fine," he said. I was nervous, but I agreed, wanting to show them I trusted them both. We handed over the keys and off they went, laughter and excitement trailing behind them. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang. It was Lila, her voice trembling. "Mum, can you come get us?" she asked. My heart sank. "What happened? Are you both okay?" I could feel the panic rising. We quote, "re-fine, but Jenna, she left us here. She just left with her friend. They're going to the concert without us." Lila's words were hurried, and I could hear the hurt in her voice. They'd stopped at a restaurant before the show, and Jenna had apparently decided that she didn't want to wait for Lila and her friend, so she just left them. I was furious and scared all at once. My daughter was stranded miles from home because Jenna decided her own plans were more important. Jake overheard the call and went silent, his face a mixture of anger and shame. He tried calling Jenna, but she didn't pick up, so I ordered an Uber to get the girls. When Jake finally got through to Jenna, his voice was low and controlled, but I could tell he was barely holding it together. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that Lila and her friend were taking too long, and she didn't want to miss the concert. I couldn't hold back anymore. Jake, this isn't a misunderstanding. She left them stranded. That's not okay. He nodded, defeated. I know. I'll talk to her when she gets home, Dot. But when Jenna finally came back, the confrontation didn't go as planned. She was defensive, claiming she didn't think it was a big deal. She said Lila could have figured it out, as if leaving her stepsister stranded was just a minor inconvenience. When I tried to explain how serious this was, she cut me off, rolling her eyes and muttering, "Whatever," before walking out. And Jake, he just stood there looking as helpless as I felt. I waited for him to set her straight, but all he said was, "Jenna, you're grounded. Grounded, that's it." I was stunned, feeling like I was watching my own authority vanish right before my eyes. Here I was, helping pay for Jenna's dance classes and her activities, and this was the thanks I got. It felt like everything I'd tried to do for our blended family was unraveling. My daughter's safety had been put at risk, and grounding Jenna for a few days just didn't seem to fit the seriousness of what had happened. When I told Jake how I felt, he just said, "She's a kid. Kids make mistakes." But to me, it was more than just a mistake. It was a serious breach of trust, and I couldn't just brush it off. I'd done everything I could to make Jenna feel welcomed. I even covered her dance fees because Jake's work hours had been cut. But now, it felt like my efforts meant nothing. That night, I made a decision. Until Jenna started taking responsibility, I wasn't going to keep paying for her classes. I'd been trying so hard to make this family work, but it was clear I was the only one taking it seriously. When I told Jake, he accused me of overreacting, saying I was punishing Jenna over one mistake, Dot. But to me, it was more than that. It was about accountability, about showing both girls that actions have consequences. I wasn't just going to pretend that everything was okay when my daughter had been left in the middle of nowhere. And just like that, a new line was drawn in our family. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring my instincts. For the first time, I was standing up for myself and for Lila, even if it meant facing the fallout head-on. After the concert fiasco, things at home felt different, like a shift we could all sense, but no one was willing to admit. Jenna sulked for days, giving me cold looks whenever she saw me, and Jake, though he'd grounded her, acted like I'd gone too far by pulling back on dance class support. It felt like a slap in the face. I'd put so much into making this family work, only to be treated like an outsider, and honestly, it stung. Jake and I barely talked. When we did, it was strained, like we were both trying not to say what we really thought. Every night, I'd go over it in my head, wondering if I'd gone too far. But I kept landing on the same thought. Jenna's actions had consequences, and brushing this off would only send her the wrong message. The tension at home was hard on Lila too. She was quieter than usual, spending most of her time in her room or at friends' houses, avoiding Jenna and the awkwardness of our fractured home. One evening, while I was cleaning up after dinner, she came into the kitchen and hesitated before speaking. "Mum, can I talk to you about something?" she asked, her voice soft. Dot. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" She looked down, fidgeting with her hands. "It's just... Jenny's been kind of mean to me for a while now, even before all of this." She paused like she was deciding how much to say, then continued. "Sometimes she takes my things and doesn't give them back. And there was this one time she deleted some of my drawings from my laptop. I felt a surge of anger mixed with guilt. Lila had been holding this in, not wanting to add to the tension, and here I was, thinking we'd just hit a bump in the road when it was more like a landslide. She told me about how Jenna would sometimes belittle her or act like she was being overly sensitive, and then it hit me. Lila had been quietly enduring this, keeping it to herself to protect me. I hugged her, my heart heavy. "I'm so sorry, Lila. I should have seen it. I'll make sure this stops." That night, after Lila went to bed, I sat alone, feeling the weight of it all. This wasn't just about a single incident or teenage drama. This was about respect, about making sure Lila felt safe in her own home, and that was non-negotiable. The next day, I had a long talk with Jake. I told him everything Lila had told me about how Jenna's behavior had been bothering her for months. He looked uncomfortable, defensive even, but he listened. "She's just a kid," he said finally, like it was some kind of explanation. "She doesn't mean any harm. Maybe she's just adjusting to this new family setup." I shook my head, frustrated. "Jake, I get it. But this is about Lila too. She's been keeping quiet, trying not to rock the boat. It's not fair to her, Dot." He sighed, clearly torn. "I'll talk to Jenna again. I just don't want to push her too hard. She's been through a lot. Lila's been through a lot too, Jake." "We both have," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The conversation ended with him reluctantly agreeing to talk to Jenna about respecting Lila's space, but I knew it wasn't going to be enough. Jake wasn't ready to hold Jenna accountable in a way that would make a real difference. And it felt like we were still just tiptoeing around the real issue. In the following days, it felt like I was living in someone else's house. Jenna acted like she was the one wronged, snapping at Lila, barely saying a word to me, and avoiding Jake. Every time I saw her ignoring Lila or taking up all the space in the living room, my frustration grew. I didn't want to make things worse, but it was impossible to sit back and let this go on. Then came the breaking point. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and Lila had finally built up the courage to ask if she could host a few friends for a movie night. I'd been so proud of her for speaking up, and I'd spent the morning helping her set up the living room, making sure she had everything ready. Jenna was out with friends, and I thought we'd have the space to ourselves. But not long after Lila's friends arrived, Jenna and her friends came back, laughing and talking loudly, completely ignoring the fact that Lila was in the middle of her get-together. They walked right into the living room, sprawled out on the couch, and started taking over. Lila looked at me, her face a mix of embarrassment and hurt. I took a deep breath, went up to Jenna, and said calmly, "Jenna, this is Lila's time with her friends. Could you and your friends please hang out in another room?" She rolled her eyes, not even looking at me. "Why? We're not doing anything wrong, Dot, because it's Lila's night, and it's only fair that she has this space to herself. You and your friends can use the den, or go upstairs, Dot." But instead of listening, Jenna huffed and got up, leading her friends upstairs without a word. I could feel the tension in the room and could sense Lila's embarrassment, but I was done letting Jenna bulldoze her way over everyone else. That evening, I told Jake what had happened. He nodded, listening, but his response was the same. "She's going through a tough time. You know how teenagers are." I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Jake, we can't keep excusing her behavior just because she's having a rough time. Lila deserves respect too. She's been patient and kind, and she's getting walked all over, Dot." For the first time, I could see the frustration in Jake's face too. "I get it, all right, but you don't have to make Jenna out to be the bad guy here." I shook my head, realizing just how far apart we'd grown. "I'm not making her out to be anything, but I can't ignore it when my daughter feels like a guest in her own home, Dot." The words hung heavy between us. Jake left the room, and I sat there, feeling like we'd reached an unspoken crossroads. In the days that followed, the distance between Jake and me only grew. Every conversation felt like a balancing act, both of us tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. Jenna's behavior didn't change, and Jake kept acting like it was just teenage rebellion. But to me, it was more than that. It was a pattern of disregard that was hurting my daughter, and I couldn't let it continue. Finally, I decided to call Jake's bluff. I told him that I was serious about no longer paying for Jenna's dance classes until I saw real changes. I wasn't going to fund activities for someone who didn't show even the most basic respect for others in our home. Jake was furious. He told me I was being unfair and that I was holding a grudge, but I didn't back down. "This isn't about holding a grudge, Jake. This is about boundaries. I'm tired of being the one bending over backward for everyone else, while my own daughter is treated like she doesn't matter." Dot, he stormed out. and for a moment, I felt a wave of guilt. But deep down, I knew this was the right thing to do. I had to stand up for Lila and for myself, even if it meant risking the future of our blended family. In the days that followed, Jake barely spoke to me. Jenna continued with her icy behavior, making it clear she blamed me for the changes. But there was something in Lila's eyes, maybe relief, maybe a sense of validation, that told me I'd made the right call. She knew I had her back, and I could see a weight lifting from her shoulders. It was becoming painfully clear that if Jake and I couldn't get on the same page, this living arrangement wasn't going to work. And for the first time, I found myself considering an option I hadn't allowed myself to think about before. Maybe it was time to walk away from this blended family for both of our sakes. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done sacrificing my daughter's well-being just to keep the peace. The tension in our house finally reached a boiling point after that last standoff. Jake and I barely spoke, both of us dancing around conversations we knew we needed to have. Jenna kept her distance, and Lila seemed like she was walking on eggshells every day, avoiding any place Jenna might be. It was painfully clear that we were no longer a family. We were just people sharing the same space, hoping to avoid one another. I couldn't keep pretending things would magically improve. One evening, after dinner, I asked Jake to sit down and talk. I needed him to see the situation through my eyes and to understand that this wasn't just about teenage rebellion or our kids not getting along. It was about the environment we'd created, the impact it was having on Lila, and how unsustainable this was. Jake, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I feel like we've been on opposite sides since this all started. I've been trying to make this family work, but I can't keep ignoring how much it's hurting Lila and me. She's afraid to be in her own home, and that's just not okay. He looked at me, tired but defiant. So, what are you saying? That Jenna and I are the problem? No, I said, taking a deep breath. I'm saying that we've been living in this house with completely different expectations. I've been hoping you'd support me and set real boundaries with Jenna, but that hasn't happened. And now we're both paying the price. He shook his head, frustrated. You're acting like I'm not trying. Jenna's struggling, and I don't want to push her away. I know you're upset, but she's my daughter. I have to protect her too. I understand that, Jake. I really do, I said, my voice softening. But protecting her can't come at the cost of everyone else's happiness. Jenna needs to understand that her actions have consequences, and if we're not united in this, it's only going to keep getting worse. He looked down, silent, and I could see he was wrestling with the reality of what I was saying. But there was no easy fix here. We were both too entrenched, and I knew in my heart that if we kept going like this, we'd only end up resenting each other. After a long silence, Jake finally spoke. Maybe we rushed this, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I thought we could make it work, that we could bring the girls together, but maybe they weren't ready. Maybe we weren't ready. Hearing him say it out loud was both a relief and a heartbreak. I nodded, feeling tears I'd been holding back for months. I think you're right. I wanted so badly to make this family work, to give the girls a sense of normalcy. But it's clear now that we're just hurting them. We sat there in silence, both of us absorbing the weight of what we'd just admitted. The next day, we talked to the girls separately, explaining that Jake and Jenna would be moving out. It wasn't easy, and there were tears and questions, but there was also a sense of relief, a lifting of the tension that had held us all captive for months. In the days that followed, Jake started packing up their things. He and I were civil, both of us trying to keep things as smooth as possible for the girls. But every now and then there would be a look, a moment of regret in his eyes. I felt it too, that lingering sense of what might have been, but I knew this was the right choice. We tried, but sometimes trying just wasn't enough. Lilia was quiet during those last days, staying close to me as if afraid this peace might be fleeting. One evening, after Jenna and Jake had moved most of their things out, Lila came into the kitchen where I was cleaning up and gave me a hug. It was unexpected, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the years of weight and worry melt away. Thank you, Mum, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, for standing up for me. I know it wasn't easy. I pulled back and looked at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You don't ever have to thank me for that, Lila. You're my priority, always. I'm just sorry I didn't see things sooner, Dot. We both smiled, the kind of shared smile you get when you've been through something hard together and come out the other side. From that moment on, it felt like we were starting fresh. The house was quieter and emptier, but it felt peaceful. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. A few weeks passed, and I settled into this new rhythm of life, just me and Lila. We had our routines, our little rituals, like movie nights on Fridays and Sunday afternoon baking sessions. It wasn't the big, blended family I'd envisioned, but it was ours, and it felt right. Jake and I stayed in touch here and there. He eventually moved into an apartment across town, and we had a few polite conversations about how things were going. He told me he'd started seeing a family therapist with Jenna, working on some of the things we hadn't been able to address. It was good to know he was taking it seriously, but I couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness that it had taken us falling apart for him to see it. Months went by, and slowly Lila and I built a new life. She started opening up more, sharing things with me that I hadn't even realized she'd been holding back. There was this newfound openness between us, and every day, I saw her confidence and happiness grow. It was a reminder that I'd made the right choice, no matter how difficult it had been. It's been a year now since Jake and Jenna moved out, and looking back, I can see all the little signs I'd missed along the way. I'd been so focused on creating the perfect family that I hadn't noticed the cracks until they were too wide to ignore. I wanted so badly for things to work, for the girls to bond, and for Jake to be the partner I could depend on. But sometimes life doesn't work out the way we plan, and that's okay. I learned that trying to force something to fit just because you want it to can sometimes do more harm than good. Now, Lila and I are in a place of peace. Our home is calm, filled with laughter, quiet conversations, and the kind of warmth that doesn't feel forced. We've made new memories, created traditions just for us, and there's this feeling of safety that I know we both cherish. Jake reached out recently, saying he'd like to reconnect when the time feels right and maybe even bring Jenna along if she's comfortable. I'm open to it, but this time I'm going in with my eyes wide open, knowing that it's okay to keep boundaries and that not every relationship has to fit the mold of family to be meaningful. For now, I'm grateful for where we are, for the strength it took to make tough decisions, and for the bond I share with my daughter. We've walked through fire and come out stronger. This isn't the family I'd set out to build, but it's the one that feels real, solid, and true. And at the end of the day, that's all we really need. Story 2. Here's the deal then. I have always supported my family, particularly my niece. Since my brother died away a few years ago, her mother, my sister-in-law, has been struggling. She is 13 years old. I helped out where I could, covered costs, and ensured my niece wouldn't be left without. I never gave it a second consideration, to be honest. Family? Correct. In any case, the day this all happened began like any other. After a typical workday, I was on my way home. I'm excited to relax and perhaps watch some television. However, I realized something was wrong as soon as I entered the room. I could not stop my phone from ringing. When I examined it, I noticed some texts and a few missed calls from my sister Law. None of them made much sense, though. "You must pick up," she said again. "You're in danger and it's serious. No background, nothing." I'll admit that at first I dismissed it. I assumed there was some financial drama or something. I disregarded it since she had been in and out of financial trouble recently and I had previously had to save her. I assumed that when I had settled down I would give her a call back, but about an hour later I received another call. However, it came from a blocked number this time. When I responded, I assumed it was a hoax call, but the caller said, "Hello, is this your name? Detective so-and-so is this person. Come down to the station, please." I took notice of that. There was a sense of dread that I cannot even describe. It's the sensation that something is really wrong, but you don't know what it is. However, your stomach is yelling at you. They refused to provide me any information over the phone when I inquired what was happening. Just demanded that I come down right away. After grabbing my keys, I headed directly to the station while attempting to think of every reason why I may be there. However, I was unable to think of anything logical. They took me into one of those sterile, frigid rooms with metal seats and a table when I arrived, and the whole scene gave me the impression that I was in a horrible crime drama. With a grave expression on his face, the detective sat down across from me and inquired as to why I was there. I refused, but my mind was already racing, trying to figure out what in the world was happening. After that, he informed me that my niece had made some grave charges against me. At first, I simply blinked at him, trying to take it all in. However, I felt as though I had been hit in the belly when he reiterated what she was saying. I wouldn't even say what she was accusing me of aloud. There was something that, to be honest, made my skin crawl. I was stopped in disbelief, astonished. Naturally, my immediate reaction was to reject it. I told the detective that I couldn't believe she'd say anything so awful, that I'd never do anything like that, and that this had to be some sort of mistake. This was my niece, after all, a child I had essentially assisted in raising since her father died. It was simply nonsensical. Here's the problem, though. Right away, the detective was staring at me as if he had already decided that I was guilty. Things weren't looking good for me, he continued, adding that they had already begun an inquiry. It seems that they had also spoken with her mother, who was completely in favor of her daughter. It hurt to hear it, but I was also completely perplexed. Why would my sister-in-law just support this after all? What was the source of all this? I was in a panic at that moment. Being accused behind your back is one thing, but hearing it directly from a detective in an interview room is quite another. It a completely different degree of terror. He persisted in his questioning about if I had anything to conceal. I wanted to be honest, if there was anything. I was beginning to think I was going crazy, as if everything had been a nightmare. I was unable to wake up. After a while, he requested permission to examine my home. He gave the impression that I had no other option. I thus concurred. After all, I had nothing to conceal. I really wanted to do everything in my power to establish my innocence at that time. However, I felt nauseous at the thought of them searching my house and everything as if I were a criminal. They questioned me and kept me waiting for hours before letting me go. However, nothing was actually clarified by them. I was just informed by the detective to be accessible and that they would be following up shortly. My mind was racing with questions I didn't know the answers to, and I was in a trance as I left that station. What led to this situation? Why would my niece say such a terrible thing? And why in the world did my sister-in-law support her in that way? The reality struck me like a ton of bricks when I arrived home. My life might be ruined by this charge. Everything I had worked for, including my connections and employment. A falsehood might cause everything to fall apart. I roamed my home, reliving the day's events repeatedly in an attempt to make sense of it all. However, I kept running out of ideas. I have never had any problems with my niece. I actually believed that we were close. I had dedicated several hours to supporting her, watching out for her, and being there for her in times of need. It simply didn't make sense. I didn't get much sleep that night. My niece's allegation keeps replaying in my mind, and every time I close my eyes, I see the detective's face, the blatant injustice of it all not at me. And I continue to waver between incredulity and rage. How could your family have betrayed you in this way? Why would someone I trusted act in such a horrible manner? I kept thinking that all of this might be explained by some explanation or misunderstanding. However, I was secretly beginning to worry about the worst. Something about my sister-in-law's actions and willingness to support this lie seemed too planned and intentional. It was more than a simple miscommunication or error. It began to seem like an assault, a deliberate attempt to destroy me. I phoned in ill for work the following morning. I was too exhausted and preoccupied to even pretend that I could go through a typical day, and I knew I had to make a decision as I sat there looking at my phone indifferently. I had the option of fighting back, finding out why they were doing this and revealing the truth, or I could attempt to push through and act like this was all going to be finished. I was eager to find out, even though I had no idea what I would discover. After that terrifying grilling, I was completely destroyed. I was unable to eat or sleep. I was unable to concentrate on anything but my niece's remarks about me. I was attempting to make sense of everything. but each idea only made me feel more confused and frustrated. How could a child whom I had much aided suddenly turn against me in this way? And why would my late brother's wife, my sister-in-law, support her in doing something so inappropriate? The worst thing was that once she said that, the cops didn't simply ignore it. They were treating her seriously, interrogating me as if I'd truly done what she alleged. The whole thing felt crazy. My life was suddenly shrouded in suspicion as I sat there in my own house. I saw a change in everything around me. I couldn't get rid of the impression that something sinister was happening in my house, as if everything had somehow been polluted. I felt as though something was missing from all of this. The impression that this wasn't just a child saying something stupid persisted in my mind. There was a sense of purpose and planning. However, what? The detective working on my case then called me out of the blue. He informed me that my niece needed to be brought in for a follow-up interview. This time her mother wasn't there. I was interested in that. I had no idea why they had split them up. It was kind of a relief, though, if the cops were suspecting anything was amiss. There was a glimmer of optimism that perhaps this whole matter will be resolved. What transpired in that room during her second interview is unknown to me. All I know is that everything changed when I received a call a few hours later. The detective's voice changed, as if he had suddenly decided to support me. He informed me that my niece acknowledged fabricating the charge, the breath from my lungs. She fabricated it. I wanted it to be a lie, after all. Since that was a lie, of course, it was something another entirely to hear it verified. I had an odd mixture of relief, rage, and, to be honest, outright betrayal. I questioned him about her words and the reasons behind her dishonesty. However, he stated that he was unable to provide all the information over the phone. He just informed me that she had been coerced into it by her mother, my sister in law. When I hear it, I cannot explain it. Blood is thicker than water. Isn't that a saying? However, I got the impression that my own family had carelessly thrown me under the bus at that very time. My sister-in-law had coerced her own child, her own daughter, into lying and accusing me of a crime that could not be forgiven. For what purpose? There was no sense about it. The detective explained everything to me when we met in person. My niece had admitted that they needed money, so her mother had urged her to fabricate the accusation. Additionally, my sister-in-law believed that this would be a simple method of blackmailing me. The whole idea was to put me in a situation where I would be so afraid of the harm to my name that I would pay up, keep quiet, and protect myself. As he told it, I sat there in awe. Each utterance felt like a jab in the back. I had always known that following the death of my brother, my sister-in-law had experienced financial difficulties. I had jumped in to help so many times for that reason. A little extras here and there to make sure they were all right, groceries and clothing for my niece. And that was something she used against me. Weaponized it in an attempt to get even more cash from me. In her statement, the detective clarified that, according to my niece, she attempted to push back. She admitted that she was afraid to do it at first because she knew it was bad. However, her mother had informed her that they had no other choice, that there was no other option. Consider a 13-year-old girl being instructed to do something really wrong by her own mother since it was the only option. I felt repulsed. It had always seemed to me that I knew my sister-in-law. She's family, after all. She wed my brother, and after his death, I felt obligated to take over and support them. However, I was unable to comprehend how she had tricked her kid into saying something that may ruin my life. How hopeless, how self-centered must you be to subject your child to that? If I had any suspicion that she would be in such serious financial difficulty, the investigator inquired. She had brought up money concerns a few times, but nothing particularly serious. I told him honestly. She was constantly evasive about it, implying that she could want some assistance, etc. Yes, I have previously assisted her, but I was unaware that she had reached a place where she would be so unfaithful to me. I was unable to sit still. I had trembling hands. My thoughts are racing. I couldn't stop thinking about how many times I had trusted her, allowed her into my life, and allowed her into my house. And now, being aware that she was capable of such treachery. It was unbelievable. Although I had heard of individuals defrauding one another of their money, This was my family. I never imagined that I would experience it, much less from the folks I had been going out of my way to assist. Then my niece came along. I was no longer sure how I felt about her. I had some sympathy for her. After all, she is only a little child. She had nevertheless complied. Even though she knew exactly what such words might do to me, she would still say them. Her face kept coming to mind. The child I had assisted in raising is now eternally linked to a falsehood that almost destroyed my life. Although he couldn't promise anything, the detective assured me that they would follow up with my sister Dash in Dash Law. Even with my niece's confession, he said, it would be difficult to demonstrate the full scope of my sister-in-law's involvement, particularly if she made an effort to deny it. I felt enraged but helpless. I felt ill at the idea that she would somehow escape the repercussions for all of this. After thanking the detective and shaking his hand, I walked out of the station. Still trying to take it all in, I wandered home in a haze. I had the impression that I was divided. I was relieved that my name was cleared on the one hand, that the deception had been revealed. On the other hand, I felt angry and depressed. My family was this. For financial gain, my own blood and flesh had attempted to destroy me. Upon arriving home, I simply sat silently and repeatedly relived every experience. The satisfaction of being found not guilty was present, but it was hidden behind layers of hurt, betrayal, and rage. I had no idea what to do. I just knew that nothing would ever be the same. I was hardly able to keep myself together once the detective revealed the facts. My sister-in-law had even gone so far as to frame me using her own daughter. The feeling of it is difficult to describe. The betrayal, the wrath, the shock. Everything simply came to me in waves. Fundamentally, though, I understood what I needed to accomplish. I had to face her. I couldn't possibly overlook this without listening to her pitiful justification for why she believed that any of this was even somewhat acceptable. I made no attempt to call. My mind was racing the entire way as I drove directly to her apartment. I couldn't stop reflecting on all the moments from the previous few years. Every money I'd donated to make sure they were all right. Every time I'd assisted her. And she did this after turning around. I didn't even know what to say when I saw her, and my fury was boiling. I just knew that I wanted clarification. She answered the door when I arrived, seeming startled but unfrightened, which in some ways infuriated me. She stood there as if she hadn't just attempted to destroy my life. I just barely kept myself from blowing up at that moment. Rather, I remarked, "We need to talk now," while looking her in the eye. She made an effort to appear calm by pretending to smile, and asked if I wanted to sit down as though we were having a typical chat. I refused to accept it. "Why?" "To go right to the point," I asked. "Why would you do this? Why would you force your own daughter to fabricate such a grave situation?" She first appeared surprised, as if she hadn't anticipated my directness. Then she got better and let out this theatrical, exhausted sigh. "You have no idea how difficult it has been," she added. "Since your brother's death, things have been extremely difficult for me as a single mother. I don't have any money, but you do." "And stop," I said. I didn't want to listen to her justifications. "You attempted to destroy my life. You instructed your daughter to make a repulsive accusation against me. What were you doing, and do you know?" Acting defensive, she turned her head aside and crossed her arms. "I had no other option," she mumbled, continuing to avoid eye contact. "We're struggling while you're doing great." All right, I was desperate. People who are desperate will do desperate things. What I was hearing was unbelievable. People who are desperate will do desperate things. That's why she did it. You believed that the best course of action was to drag my name through the mud because you didn't have enough money? I almost screamed. Every time you've asked for aid, I've provided it. And you pay me back like this? I became further angrier when she rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. You give the impression that you've done a lot for us. However, a few handouts here and there don't really address every issue I have. I really needed assistance. Genuine assistance." The absurdity of this made me chuckle uncontrollably. I've covered everything. Food, clothing, school supplies, etc. To what extent did you intend to milk me for assistance? She remained mute, but when she did look up at me, Her jaw was tightened in annoyance. "You can say that with ease. You have no idea what it's like to struggle every single day, Dot. Maybe you would give us what we truly need if I could only frighten you a bit," I reasoned. "Do you fear me?" The term kept repeating in my mind. "You used your daughter to accuse me of something awful in an attempt to intimidate me into giving me money. Do you realize what a disaster that is? Or have you become completely devoid of reality?" She explained it wasn't meant to go this far as her face stiffened. "I assumed you would simply pay up in silence, perhaps feel awful enough to support us in the long run. You must comprehend. I didn't intend for things to get so out of control, becoming unmanageable. My temples were thumping with my heartbeat. You instructed your daughter to make false accusations against me. A crime? Have you thought about what this may do to me, or how it may affect her?" She turned away once again without uttering a word. She seemed to have erected a wall around herself that was impenetrable. She didn't feel guilty or aware of the damage she had almost inflicted. She continued to grumble about how difficult her life was, as though it in some way made everything acceptable. "I had faith in you." I spoke, attempting to maintain a steady tone. "I had faith in both you and her. Since the death of my brother, I have made an effort to support you both. You turn it against me too. You tried to blackmail me by using your own daughter as a weapon. Are you even able to hear yourself?" After a moment, she huffed and looked at me angrily. "All right. Perhaps it went too far, but as I mentioned, desperate times need desperate means." I shook my head, experiencing an inexplicable mixture of revulsion and rage. "I stated that being desperate is not the same as being cruel. Furthermore, your actions were blatantly harsh. You included your own child in your attempt to ruin my life for financial gain, She didn't answer. Like a reprimanded kid, she just crossed her arms and gazed at the ground. It dawned on me then that she would not hear whatever I said. She persuaded herself that she was the victim and that in some way her struggles justified what she had done. What do you know? Finally, unable to contain my resentment, I spoke. We quote, "Re-finished. Never call me to ask for money. Don't ask me for assistance. From now on, you're on your own." She appeared to get out of her pout after that. Her eyes widened and she began to object. However, what about my daughter? She needs stability. She must. A mother who doesn't use her as a weapon is what she needs. I fired back. And you're obviously not that. You've stated quite clearly that if it works for you, you're prepared to use her as a pawn. Therefore, no, I will not be present to tidy up your mess. After that, she attempted to guilt-trip me by claiming that I was being too severe and that my niece shouldn't have to bear the consequences of her errors, but it was enough for me. I went away after telling her that I wasn't going to back down. I felt as though I was breathing for the first time, but I didn't feel any closure after the confrontation. If anything, I felt even more resentful after I left. In order to portray herself as the victim, my sister-in-law had fabricated events, as though all she had done was somehow justified by her trials. The saddest aspect was that she was still unaware of the harm she had nearly done. It dawned on me then that she had no interest in either her daughter or myself. No matter the cost, she was concerned about achieving her goals. I was exhausted when I arrived home. I believed that I would find some sort of serenity if I faced her. However, it just served to highlight the extent of her betrayal. I finally saw her for who she truly was, as if a switch had been flicked. Selfish and cunning. She will stop at nothing to achieve her goals. I had no idea what would come next. However, one thing was evident. I was never able to trust her again. Following that encounter, I was exhausted. I believed that I would find some sort of closure, maybe even serenity, after finally confronting her and cutting her off. If anything, though, I was much more shaken. I felt as though I had been speaking to a wall the entire time. She didn't feel guilty or truly comprehend what she had done. In all honesty, the woman believed she was the victim in this situation. After arriving home, I spent a considerable amount of time sitting quietly and mentally reliving everything. I made an effort to ignore it, tell myself I didn't have to deal with her, that I was no longer in debt to her. But something heated up inside of me every time I remembered her contorted justifications and the lack of regret in her eyes. She had nearly destroyed my life, trying to coerce and extort me by using her own kid. and she pretended like it didn't matter, as if I were the one who was being irrational for not giving her the money that evening. I didn't get much sleep. Individuals I know, individuals who may have heard about the claims before they were resolved, were on my mind constantly. And even when my name was vindicated and the police concluded their inquiry, I couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that the harm had already been done. Such things are not simply forgotten, even after the truth is revealed. I knew what I needed to accomplish by morning. I couldn't ignore this, not after what she had attempted. Cutting her off and moving on with my life wasn't enough. I had to make her answer for it. If she would go this far just once, with another person, who's to say she wouldn't attempt it again? She even brought her own children into this situation, which was the saddest part. That child was worthy of better than a mother who would educate her to cheat and plot in order to achieve her goals. I gave the investigator who had worked on my case a call. I intended to file charges against her, I told him. At first, he was rather taken aback. I was probably thinking that I should just move on because the claim had been shown to be untrue. However, he understood when I told him everything she had said during our encounter, including the manipulation, the blackmail, and the way she put pressure on her daughter. "Are you certain?" he inquired. He told me it would be difficult to file charges, that it would take a long time, and that I would likely have to go through a lot of the events again. I was aware of that. Indeed, The thought of plunging back into the chaos I had just barely escaped frightened me. However, the more I considered it, the more I understood that I couldn't allow fear to prevent me from doing morally. I assured him that I was certain. Of course, I wasn't the only one. It was also for my niece. A wake-up call was needed for the child. Something to demonstrate to her the consequences of her conduct, even when the person you trust the most is putting pressure on you. Additionally, I thought it could serve as a wake-up call for my sister-in-law. But to be honest, I didn't think she would ever really understand. The weeks that followed were stressful. Everything had to be reviewed by the police, examine my assertion in further depth. Ask me even if I've ever given her financial support. I had to relive experiences I had attempted to ignore. It was also difficult. However, I kept reminding myself of my motivation. I have to ensure that no one else experienced this. I needed to keep myself and everyone else safe from her next attack. Then the day finally arrived. When the police arrived at her door, they took her into custody. To be honest, I didn't anticipate feeling anything other than relief. However, the truth struck me more forcefully than I had anticipated. After all, this was still my family, the wife of my late brother, the mother of my niece, and because of what she had done, she was now being carried away in handcuffs. However, I remained grounded when I considered what she had nearly done to me and how close she had come to ruining my life. She was to blame for this. Naturally, a few people were aware of the arrest. Family conversations catch on like wildfire. Family members called to inquire about what had transpired, suggesting that I should have just let it go and that I was out of line. However, I clarified every detail, including the blackmail and the accusation, and people began to view things my way for the most part. Some were astonished, but others still felt I was harsh, particularly when they discovered that my sister-in-law had attempted to contact me by using her own daughter. In fact, one relative informed me that I was doing the correct thing. People must acquire knowledge. There are repercussions. Knowing that at least a few individuals shared my perspective provided me some peace of mind. I couldn't help but think about my niece the day following her arrest. Now that she would most likely be temporarily placed elsewhere, I knew CPS would be involved. I felt guilty for her in part, even guilty. But then I realized that she had also been duped. I was unable to shield her from the repercussions of her behavior. Perhaps, though, this would be her opportunity to get a clear perspective. To realize that what her mother had done was unacceptable. But despite my best efforts to explain it, it still hurt. I had taken care of that child, treated her as if she were my own, and she had followed her mother's plan without considering the consequences for me. You don't simply move on from it. Within the next weeks, I concentrated on rebuilding and attempting to return to a semblance of normalcy. However, the entire encounter had left its imprint. Now I was more wary, more circumspect. Family no longer meant the same meaning. Loyalty may be one-sided, and those you trust can betray you for reasons you'll never comprehend, as I discovered the hard way. I don't regret the choice to file charges when I think back on it. I took the necessary action. In addition to protecting myself, I may have also assisted my niece in doing the same. I'm hoping that she'll come to the realization that her mother used us both. I hope she will always remember that lesson. I felt like I was in a strange limbo in the days after my sister-in-law's incarceration. There was a great deal of wrath that hadn't completely subsided, along with some relief and remorse. The events caused a great deal of division in my family. While some believed that I was entirely correct, others said that I had overreached myself by accusing her and that I ought to have simply moved on. In a way, it was humorous. No one truly knew what I had gone through, but everyone had an opinion. I made an effort to ignore it. Ultimately, I understood why I had done it. I have to hold her accountable for what she'd done, not after she had nearly destroyed my life. To be completely honest, I thought it would also teach my niece a lesson. However, it didn't make things any easier even with that knowledge. The people I believed I could rely on, my family, were like strangers to me now. It seemed odd to return to work. I felt like I had this label affixed to me for a time, as if everyone, even those who were unaware of the specifics, could see what I had gone through. I couldn't get rid of it, even though I knew it was all in my brain. I kept a close eye on every conversation, wondering whether someone was muttering or thinking something behind my back. It helped that my supervisor and a few close friends were aware of what had transpired and offered assistance. However, I continued to feel as though a thick fog was hovering over me. Every day, I would mentally relive everything, questioning whether there was anything I could have done differently. Was there anything I could have done to stop this? Should I have handled my sister-in-law with more caution? Perhaps I wasn't that trustworthy. It is strange. I'd always been an advocate of generosity until this happened, particularly with relatives. Now, though, I couldn't help but wonder about everything. Had I been too gullible to offer assistance? I had always thought of myself as a decent man. However, I began to see that being the nice guy might sometimes make you a target. A family friend who had heard tidbits of what transpired called me about a week after the arrest. I couldn't help but feel guilty when she informed me that my niece was being housed in a temporary foster family. I was aware that her mother had misled her and placed her in a precarious situation. However, that didn't change the fact that she had complied. It's difficult to see past that. I'm still hearing about her being in a foster home by herself. Strike me. That shouldn't have to happen to any child, even if they were involved in something so dysfunctional. There was a part of me that wanted to get in touch with her, maybe through CPS, check in, or provide some sort of assistance. However, each time I considered it, I only felt this wall of rage rise once again. I felt hesitant to extend forgiveness. Not quite yet. One day, perhaps. However, the injuries were too recent at the time. Furthermore, I had no idea what good it would do. She required time to absorb everything and comprehend the repercussions of her behavior. I also needed time to recover, change. After many months, I was starting to feel as though things were settling with my sister-in-law for the first time in a long time. I had distanced myself from the entire situation, and although I still felt deceived, I was becoming more adept at handling it and not allowing it to dictate every thought. After something like that, life was at last beginning to seem normal again, or as normal as it could be. Then I received a call from an unknown number one day. I nearly didn't answer. I had been avoiding strange numbers for some time, thinking they were either telemarketers or relatives attempting to cause trouble. But this one compelled me to respond. It was a calm voice on the other end. Expert. Hi there. Is this my name? Yes, I said, still a little defensive. Who is this? Sarah from Child Protective Services is here. We wanted to talk to you about a possible alternative for your niece who is in our care. I heard that. A chilly jolt struck me, and I prepared myself for whatever was about to happen. She continued by saying that since my sister-in-law's arrest, my niece had been placed in temporary foster care. It seems that they had contacted other relatives, but they were either unwilling to take her in or didn't fit the requirements. They called me to ask whether I would be interested in temporary custody. I stumbled, feeling a wave of emotions I wasn't prepared to deal with. I don't know. I'm not certain if I'm the best choice. Sarah was kind, allowing me to take it all in. She clarified that the circumstances surrounding my niece's situation were complex, that she had experienced a lot with her mother, and that her surroundings had not exactly prepared her for success. She sounded empathetic and understanding, as if she understood how difficult this was for me. Perhaps she did. She has likely dealt with similar issues in the past. In a minute, she said, "Look, I'm not suggesting that you must make a decision today. I recognize that there has been a great deal of disagreement, and this is a challenging position. Even if it's only temporary, you would have the opportunity to provide her some stability as a family member. We decided to speak again in a few days after I promised to give it some thought. I simply sat there looking at nothing when I hung up, trying to make sense of anything at all. It was daunting to think about bringing her in. I wanted to assist her in some way. She had experienced her own mess and was only a child. However, a part of me was still troubled by the sorrow and treachery she had caused. The next several days were hectic, even if her mother had forced her to do it. I was unable to concentrate at work. I also had trouble sleeping. I felt like everything else was unimportant because of the decision, which weighed heavily on me. I continued to go back and forth, attempting to consider my alternatives. On the one hand, in spite of everything that had transpired, she was still my niece. I had seen her mature. I recalled holidays, birthdays, and occasions when I had delivered food and presents. Being aware of her mother's financial difficulties, I couldn't deny that I still wanted to protect her and give her a chance at a good life since I had treated her like my own kid. I made an effort to persuade myself that perhaps, given the correct circumstances, she might be able to develop beyond what her mother had done. However, I was unable to ignore what she had done. The probe, the charge, the restless nights and ongoing nervousness, the sensation that my own life is being tried. She spoke things that had almost devastated me while staring at me with her icy practice stare. No matter how much I told myself she had been twisted, it was difficult to imagine her as an innocent child after that. I had a sneaking suspicion that she was a pawn, that she had followed instructions. However, the harm was not undone by that. The opinions of my friends were divided. Some people advised me that it would be too painful to revisit that wound. After what had transpired, it was too dangerous to bring her into my life. Others said that it may be a chance to change things, that I might be the uplifting influence she needed to change her situation if I took her in. They had no idea, however, what it was like to have someone you believed you could trust endanger your entire existence. They had never experienced that degree of treachery. I finally consented to see her. I arrived anxious and unprepared for the monitored visit that CPS had scheduled at their office. She was seated there as I entered, seeming smaller and more frail than I had recalled. When her eyes met mine, I briefly caught a glimpse of fear, possibly even remorse. She hardly looked at me as she whispered a hi. Unsure of what to say, I sat across from her. She had changed appearance, more secluded, nearly defensive. She seems to have surrounded herself with walls. I saw I was doing the same thing, even though I wasn't sure I could get through those walls. Every instinct told me to defend myself, so I sat there on high alert. In an attempt to initiate the discussion, I cleared my throat. "How are you doing?" All I could think to say was that. She gave a shrug, avoiding eye contact. "I suppose it's all right, not the same." After a little silence, she said in an almost audible whisper, "I apologize." Something in my chest constricted as I heard those words. I had been anticipating an apology. I was hoping she would admit what had occurred. It felt hollow now that she had said it, though. Or perhaps I was the hollow one. I was no longer able to tell. Unsure of when the visit might conclude, we sat there awkwardly and quiet. CPS asked whether I had made up my mind. On the way home, I realized that I already knew the answer, even though I had told them I needed a little more time. I truly wished to assist her. However, I was also aware that having her living with me would serve as a continual reminder of what I had experienced. I would constantly question if I could trust her. whether she was sincerely remorseful or whether she was simply saying what she thought I wanted to hear. And you can't construct a home that way. I phoned Sarah again a few days later and informed her of my choice. She would not be staying with me. It wasn't an easy decision, and I certainly didn't think I would ever have to make it. However, I hoped that perhaps she would find a place where she might learn from what had transpired after everything I had to do to defend myself. There she might make a new beginning free from the burden of her mother's errors. Saying farewell to relatives can be difficult, but sometimes you have to let go in order to go on.